Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we explore the chilling case of a man who murdered his wife to pursue his obsession with his stepdaughter. Frank Collins appeared to be the ideal family man. He was tall and personable, with a warm smile that made him popular among neighbors in the quiet suburban neighborhood he shared with his wife, Nancy, and her daughter, Isabella. The Collins family had all the outward signs of a stable, happy home. Frank was a local contractor, known for his dedication to his work and commitment to providing a comfortable life for his family. Nancy, kind-hearted and always ready to lend a hand to those around her, was known for her community involvement. As for Isabella, she was the kind of young woman who seemed destined for success, a bright college student with a warm presence, beloved by friends and family alike. Together, they appeared to embody the perfect family. Neighbors often saw them attending local events together: barbecues, community picnics, holiday gatherings. Frank would joke with others about family life, talking about the challenges and joys of raising a teenage stepdaughter, and sharing stories that painted him as a patient, protective father figure to Isabella. To anyone looking in, Frank and Nancy seemed to have built a loving home, and Frank's role as Isabella's stepfather looked nothing short of exemplary. People admired how close he seemed to be with Isabella. He was always ready to support her academic and personal ambitions and offered advice when she sought it. However, over time, subtle shifts in Frank's behavior started to raise questions for a few observant neighbors. Those who saw him frequently noticed his interactions with Isabella seemed a bit too attentive, almost as though he were watching her every move. Small gestures that had once seemed fatherly started to appear excessive and a little too familiar. Friends of the family, initially reassured by Frank's involvement in Isabella's life, found themselves wondering if there was something more lurking beneath the surface. But Frank always managed to mask his intentions behind a cloak of fatherly care, portraying himself as the protective parent looking out for his stepdaughter. Nancy, for her part, saw none of this. She was focused on building her life with Frank and keeping the household running smoothly. She trusted him wholeheartedly and saw his connection with Isabella as a sign of his love for both of them. In her eyes, she had finally found a husband who embraced her daughter as his own. Frank had become the family man she had dreamed of, a loving husband and a responsible stepfather. Nancy was grateful for how much stability he had brought to their lives. She never suspected that his outward warmth concealed a deep obsession that would ultimately destroy their family. To most outsiders, the Collins family looked like a model of harmony and happiness, with Frank in the role of devoted father and husband. Yet beneath this veneer of suburban contentment, a storm was brewing, one that would soon shatter everything Nancy and Isabella believed about the man at the center of their lives. As Isabella entered her 20s, Frank's attention toward her began to shift in ways that were difficult to ignore. He had once been a steady, guiding figure in her life, but now his interest took on an intensity that felt increasingly uncomfortable. Subtle at first, Frank's obsession grew steadily more apparent, though he continued to disguise it as fatherly care and concern. Isabella had been close to him for years, and Frank took advantage of this bond, positioning himself as her primary supporter. Nancy noticed changes, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. Frank had become more distant from her, retreating emotionally and showing little interest in their marriage. They no longer had the easy companionship they'd shared in the past, and their conversations became brief and perfunctory. He no longer seemed to look at her with the affection she remembered, and he often left the house at odd hours, claiming to be preoccupied with work or personal errands. Nancy tried to chalk up these changes to the inevitable ups and downs of marriage. She told herself that stress, their busy lives, and perhaps the pressure of raising Isabella were to blame for the shift. What Nancy didn't know was that Frank had begun to idealize Isabella to a disturbing degree. Where he once saw himself as her father figure, he now began to envision her as the partner he felt he deserved. He rationalized his growing obsession as admiration, convincing himself that it was natural to feel a bond with his stepdaughter. This twisted rationalization became the foundation of his descent into something far darker. Frank increasingly viewed Nancy as an obstacle, a barrier between himself and Isabella that had to be removed. While Nancy believed Frank's emotional distance was temporary, he was, in fact, withdrawing from her entirely. In his mind, his marriage to Nancy had become a facade, something to tolerate only for appearances. His genuine interest lay with Isabella, and he spent hours fantasizing about a future where they could be together without Nancy in the picture. His obsession with this vision grew daily, consuming his thoughts and pushing him toward a dangerous decision. Frank's behavior became more possessive. He began monitoring Isabella's activities more closely, always finding reasons to be near her, often giving unsolicited advice on her choices, her friendships, and her future. Those close to the family noticed the increasing intensity of Frank's interactions with Isabella, but they struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Some found it odd but dismissed it, thinking perhaps he was overprotective because she was reaching adulthood. Others simply assumed Frank was being an involved parent, as he'd always been. But to Frank, this was something far darker. Nancy, though bewildered by the changes, still believed Frank was loyal. She assumed he was devoted to her and to Isabella's future. Yet Frank's true feelings had grown into a fixation so strong that it soon overtook his reason and morality, driving him to plot a future without Nancy in their lives. Nancy had no idea that her husband's every thought, every move, was now driven by this twisted vision of a life with her daughter. While she held on to the belief that her family could return to normal, Frank had already made up his mind. One warm summer evening, Nancy disappeared without a trace. It was unlike her to vanish without telling anyone, and her sudden absence quickly sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Just a day prior, she had confided in a friend that she was feeling unsettled and needed time to clear her mind, mentioning that perhaps a weekend away would help her regain perspective. She hadn't revealed much about what troubled her, only that she had felt distant from Frank lately and needed some time to think. So when she failed to show up to an event she had promised to attend, people assumed she was taking time for herself. Frank played the role of a concerned, grieving husband flawlessly. When he eventually notified the authorities, he reported that Nancy had been under a lot of stress and implied that she might have left due to marital strain or a midlife crisis. He told the police she had seemed distracted, perhaps even on edge, in the days leading up to her disappearance. To those around him, Frank looked genuinely worried, a man who couldn't understand why his wife would just leave without any explanation. Friends and neighbors were sympathetic, consoling him as he shook his head in supposed disbelief, wondering aloud what could have pushed Nancy to abandon her family. Police began their investigation, interviewing friends, relatives, and neighbors, but they found few leads. There were no signs of a struggle at the house, no obvious clues left behind. Nancy's belongings were mostly untouched, as if she had simply vanished. Investigators checked her credit card activity and cell phone records, but they uncovered nothing to suggest she had left of her own accord. Weeks passed without any sign of her, and with no leads or concrete evidence, the case quickly grew cold. To the police, her disappearance appeared voluntary. Perhaps she had left to start a new life, although those who knew her best found that theory difficult to accept. During this time, Frank continued to play the part of a distraught husband. He cooperated with investigators, allowing them to search the house, and spoke to the media, appealing to Nancy directly in case she was watching. He put up missing person flyers around town, participated in search efforts, and expressed grief at community gatherings. Yet, while he was publicly the heartbroken husband, behind closed doors, Frank was busy setting the groundwork for a new life without Nancy, a life he hoped to share with Isabella. With Nancy gone, Frank became even more involved in Isabella's life, moving quickly to strengthen his influence over her. He stepped into the role of her protector, a figure she could rely on in her mother's absence. Friends who saw them together commented on Frank's apparent devotion, noting that he seemed even more attentive than before. If anyone suspected his motives, they kept their concerns to themselves. To outsiders, Frank was a man doing his best to hold his family together in the wake of an unthinkable tragedy. As the months dragged on, the community began to lose hope of finding Nancy. Her case remained open, but with no new leads, Attention slowly waned. Most people accepted that she had either left for reasons known only to herself or had met with some misfortune beyond anyone's control. Frank, satisfied that his plan had gone undetected, felt emboldened. He believed he had successfully eliminated Nancy from his life, freeing him to pursue his twisted dream of a future with Isabella. Months passed without any progress in Nancy's case, and the once diligent search efforts began to taper off. People assumed Nancy had either left of her own will or was lost to some tragic fate beyond anyone's understanding. Frank, however, seemed strangely relieved by the lack of developments. He had maintained a respectful period of mourning but soon appeared to settle comfortably into his new role as the head of the household, now without Nancy. He used this newfound freedom to pull Isabella even closer, claiming he wanted to support her through the pain of her mother's disappearance. To outsiders, Frank seemed to be a devoted stepfather, striving to bring normalcy back to their lives. Frank's control over Isabella tightened in subtle ways. He became her confidant, the person she leaned on in her time of grief and uncertainty. He discouraged her from going out with friends, saying she needed time to heal and that he was the only one who truly understood her loss. Isabella, reeling from the emotional shock of losing her mother, found herself leaning more on Frank than ever before, feeling that he was her only source of stability. What she didn't realize was that Frank had orchestrated this situation to place himself as her only support system, manipulating her vulnerability to solidify his presence in her life. Despite Frank's efforts to maintain his mask, rumors continued to circulate among neighbors. Several had noted his close attachment to Isabella, finding it odd that he seemed almost possessive. One neighbor, in particular, had observed Frank's peculiar behavior around Isabella, sensing an underlying tension in his interactions with her. They recalled seeing him watching her intently on several occasions in a way that felt uncomfortable to witness. This neighbor decided to share their concerns with the police, mentioning that Frank had been acting strangely since Nancy's disappearance and often exhibited behavior that seemed out of place for a grieving husband and stepfather. These observations reignited police interest in Nancy's case, especially given the fact that her disappearance had left many unanswered questions. With this new information, investigators decided to take a closer look at Frank, re-examining his statements and actions since Nancy's disappearance. They obtained a warrant to search the Collins property more thoroughly, this time paying special attention to any areas Frank might have tried to conceal. Their initial sweep had found nothing unusual, but they were determined to dig deeper. As investigators combed through the garage, they discovered several unsettling clues that had previously gone unnoticed. They found small traces of blood and remnants of Nancy's personal belongings, all hidden in the back corner behind a shelf of tools. Even more suspiciously, they uncovered a large bag of cement that had clearly been used recently. Following this lead, they searched the backyard, where they discovered a freshly laid area of soil near a garden bed, covered with stones and appearing out of place compared to the rest of the yard. When they began excavating the site, the horrific truth was uncovered. Beneath the soil lay Nancy's remains, confirming that her disappearance had been anything but voluntary. The community was left in shock as the news spread, the idyllic image of the Collins family shattered by the horrifying discovery. Investigators now had the evidence they needed to charge Frank with Nancy's murder. In his attempt to play the grieving husband, he had left behind just enough clues to expose the dark truth behind her disappearance. The public was horrified by the revelation, and Isabella, upon hearing the news, was devastated. She had never suspected her stepfather of such cruelty or imagined that he could be capable of taking her mother's life. In an instant, her entire world was upended as she realized the man she had relied on in her time of grief had orchestrated her mother's death to fulfill his twisted obsession. The revelation of Nancy's murder sent shockwaves through the community, leaving friends, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances reeling. The police wasted no time in arresting Frank, and the ensuing investigation revealed just how meticulously he had planned everything. Step by step, they pieced together his chilling plot to eliminate Nancy and clear the way to pursue a life with Isabella, Every detail from his manipulative behavior toward Isabella to his calculated disposal of Nancy's body painted a picture of a man who had no remorse, only a relentless drive to control and possess. As Frank sat in jail awaiting trial, the media frenzy around the case escalated, with headlines chronicling the grim details of his obsession. Friends of the family who had initially believed him to be a devoted husband and stepfather were left grappling with the reality that Frank's so-called love had driven him to unimaginable cruelty. The true depth of his manipulation came to light, with investigators discovering that he had been psychologically isolating Isabella for years, carefully orchestrating a bond that would make her feel dependent on him after Nancy was out of the picture. Frank's ultimate goal had been to transform Isabella from stepdaughter to partner, a vision that sickened everyone who heard it. During his trial, Frank's attempts to justify his actions revealed just how deeply he had twisted his perception of reality. He claimed that he had killed Nancy out of a misguided sense of love, arguing that he deserved a life with Isabella, free from Nancy's interference. His warped rationalizations shocked even the seasoned courtroom, leaving jurors, lawyers, and onlookers horrified. It was clear that Frank had completely lost touch with any moral compass, and that his obsession had driven him to destroy the family he had once claimed to cherish. Witnesses testified to his disturbingly intense behavior toward Isabella, describing moments that now took on a sinister meaning in light of his confession. Isabella, devastated and betrayed, found herself at the center of an overwhelming media storm. The very person she had leaned on for strength in the wake of her mother's disappearance was revealed to be the monster who had shattered her family. She withdrew from public life, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy while carrying the burden of her mother's tragic end. Support from friends and therapy offered her some solace, but the trauma of Frank's actions left deep scars that would take years to heal. The trial concluded with Frank's conviction for first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemning him as a man who had betrayed his own family for a dark, twisted fantasy. Frank's face showed no remorse as the sentence was read, his cold detachment underscoring the gravity of his crimes. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing he would never again be free to manipulate or harm anyone. The story of Nancy's murder and Frank's obsession with Isabella became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how even those closest to us can harbor dark, dangerous secrets. Friends and family members were haunted by the signs they had missed, the small, unsettling clues that had hinted at Frank's descent into madness. As the years passed, people in the community continued to remember Nancy and the tragic story that had shattered her family, often reflecting on how easily trust can be exploited. Isabella, though forever marked by the experience, found a way to move forward. She dedicated herself to honoring her mother's memory, working with advocacy groups to support victims of domestic violence, and helping others recognize the early warning signs of manipulation and obsession. While the pain of her mother's loss and her stepfather's betrayal would never fully fade, Isabella's resilience became an inspiration for those who knew her. She transformed her tragedy into a force for good, determined to prevent others from falling prey to people like Frank. The Collins family story faded from the headlines with time, but those who remembered it carried with them a somber lesson: not everyone who claims to love and protect has pure intentions, and sometimes the darkest motives can be hiding behind the most familiar faces.